It was the winter of 1985 in Munich, a bitterly cold morning when the hospital windows trembled under the weight of snow. Inside the university hospital, a letter lay folded in Freddie Mercury's pocket, written by Dr. Hans Müller, an oncologist and lifelong Queen fan. In it, the doctor told Freddie about a group of children battling cancer who began each day listening to "We Are the Champions." They sang along with IV tubes in their arms and hope flickering in their tired eyes. Freddie had read that letter in his Frankfurt hotel room after a concert, and something in it shattered the invisible wall between the superstar and the man behind the makeup. He didn't call his manager, didn't tell the press. The next morning, he asked his driver to take him to the hospital. "No cameras," he said, "just me and the piano." When Freddie stepped through the glass doors of the Munich University Hospital on December 17, 1985, the air seemed to change. The usual scent of antiseptic and silence of long corridors gave way to an unspoken hum of disbelief. Nurses paused mid-stride. Doctors froze with clipboards in their hands. There he was, the voice that had shaken stadiums across continents, now walking quietly through a hallway lined with wheelchairs and oxygen tanks. Freddie wore a wool coat and dark glasses, his hair pulled back, no trace of the flamboyant stage persona that had defined him. He moved slowly, as if afraid his presence might disturb the fragile peace of that place. When a little girl named Anna reached out her trembling hand, he bent down, removed his glasses and smiled. "Darling," he whispered, "you're far braver than I've ever been on stage." The child giggled weakly, and in that single sound, something inside Freddie broke. The distance between the performer and the people he sang for vanished completely. As he continued down the corridor, a nurse rolled an old upright piano from the recreation room into the pediatric ward. The instrument was slightly out of tune, with keys yellowed by time, but Freddie's eyes lit up. "Perfect," he said softly. He sat down, tested a few notes, and the sound echoed like a heartbeat through the walls. The children began gathering, some in wheelchairs, some holding their IV poles like walking sticks, others peeking from behind doors. The doctors stood silently at the back, trying to hide their emotion. Freddie glanced around and said, "This isn't a concert, it's a family reunion." And with that, his fingers found the opening chords of "Love of My Life." The melody floated through the sterile air, wrapping itself around every fragile soul in that room, turning fear into stillness and stillness into awe. The first notes of "Love of My Life" shimmered in the cold air like a confession. Freddie's voice, stripped of its usual power and stage bravado, became something raw, intimate, almost sacred. He sang not to a crowd, but to the quiet rhythm of machines that kept fragile hearts beating. Every word carried a trembling warmth, a softness that no arena could ever contain. A boy named Lucas, barely 8 years old, sat nearest to the piano. His skin was pale, his eyes tired, but when Freddie's gaze met his, something like fire flickered back to life. Lucas mouthed the lyrics, missing some, whispering others, but Freddie slowed down, letting the boy's small voice blend with his. The entire room froze, even the doctors in the hallway. They weren't witnessing a performance. They were witnessing surrender, the kind that only happens when music and pain collide into something divine. As Freddie reached the chorus, his voice cracked slightly, but he didn't stop. He pressed on, letting emotion lead him where technique could not. Tears ran freely down his face, and his hands trembled over the keys. Behind him, nurses began to cry silently, clutching their masks. One doctor covered his mouth, trying not to sob aloud. Lucas let go of his IV pole and simply listened, his eyes wide, as if trying to memorize the moment forever. When the song ended, there was no applause, no movement, just the sound of quiet breathing and the faint hum of medical equipment. Freddie turned to the boy, gently touched his cheek, and whispered, "You sang beautifully, little one." Lucas smiled weakly and said, "So did you." It was in that fragile exchange that the entire ward finally broke down. Doctors, nurses, patients, all weeping together. bound by one man's voice and a moment that would never be repeated. When the final note faded, Freddie didn't rush to leave. He stayed seated, his hands resting softly on the piano keys, as if afraid to break the fragile peace that had settled over the room. One by one the children approached him, not like fans, but like old friends. He listened to their stories, their fears, their tiny dreams that somehow still burned beneath the shadow of sickness. Anna wanted to be a dancer. Lucas said he wanted to visit London one day to see where Queen recorded their songs. Freddie smiled at each of them with the tenderness of a father, nodding as if making silent promises. "You'll get there, darling," he said to Lucas, his voice trembling with sincerity. "And when you do, tell them Freddie said you'd make it." The nurses brought tea, but he barely touched it. His focus never left those small faces. For perhaps the first time in his life, he wasn't performing. He was simply present, vulnerable, real. A young doctor asked quietly if he could take a photo, but Freddie refused with a gentle shake of his head. "No cameras," he said. "Let this moment stay where it belongs, in here." He tapped his chest softly. The staff understood. Some turned away, unable to stop crying. Before leaving, Freddie looked around the room one last time, memorizing every face, every soft breath. He promised to send a record player and signed albums for the children, then walked toward the exit. But as he reached the door, Lucas called out, "Freddie! Will you sing one more?" Freddie turned, smiled through glassy eyes, and said, "For you, my brave little champion, always." Then, in a trembling voice, he began humming the chorus of "We Are the Champions." Walking down the hall as the children joined in, their voices faint but fierce. The echo lingered long after he was gone, a haunting reminder that sometimes the greatest concerts happen where no one is watching. Weeks passed after that winter morning in Munich, but the memory of the hospital never left Freddie. While Queen continued touring across Europe, something inside him had shifted. The stages, once cathedrals of noise and light, now felt strangely hollow compared to that quiet hospital room filled with fragile voices. In hotel rooms, he'd sit by the window, replaying the sound of Lucas's weak but fearless singing. He began writing again, but the lyrics were softer, more reflective. He confided to his close friend, Peter Freestone, "It's strange, darling. I felt more alive in that hospital than in front of 70,000 people." Peter noticed the change. Freddie laughed less loudly, spoke more gently. The man who once lived for applause had discovered a different kind of music, one born not from fame, but from compassion. And though he never told the world what happened that day, it quietly rewired the pulse of his art. Months later, a package arrived at the hospital, a turntable, stacks of Queen vinyls, and a handwritten note in Freddie's elegant script. "To my little champions, keep singing, no matter how tired your voices may feel. The world needs to hear you." The nurses read the note aloud, and the children burst into smiles. Lucas, now in remission, kept the letter folded inside a small journal. He would tell new patients, "Freddie said we're all champions, so we sing every morning." The tradition lived on. The hospital's pediatric ward began each day with "We Are the Champions," not through speakers, but through their own trembling voices. Dr. Müller later wrote to Freddie to thank him, though he never knew if the letter reached him. Yet somehow it didn't matter. The spirit of that morning had taken root, invisible but eternal, in the corridors where hope had once struggled to breathe. As 1986 unfolded, Freddie's energy on stage was still electric, but behind the curtain he began to feel the first quiet whispers of exhaustion that fame couldn't mask. During rehearsals, he'd pause longer between songs, pretending to adjust the microphone, when in truth he was catching his breath. The memory of that hospital day in Munich returned to him like a mirror he couldn't look away from. He started wondering if fate had placed him there, not just to comfort those children, but to remind himself of something deeper, that life was fragile, fleeting, and mercilessly beautiful. One night, after a show in Berlin, he sat alone at the piano in the empty arena. The lights were off except for a single spotlight above him. His fingers wandered to the melody of Love of My Life, and as he sang softly, tears fell onto the keys. He whispered into the darkness, "I hope Lucas is still singing." For the first time, the thought of his own mortality didn't scare him, it humbled him. In interviews, he brushed off questions about slowing down, joking as always, "Darling, I'll rest when I'm dead." But his close circle knew better. There was a softness to him now, a gentler rhythm beneath the flamboyance. He visited hospitals quietly, often without telling anyone. Sometimes he'd bring flowers, other times just his presence, a silent gesture that carried the same weight as a song. Peter Freestone once said he didn't want to be remembered for being loud, but for being real. And that reality was what he'd found in Munich, stripped of lights, makeup, and fame. It wasn't the spotlight that made Freddie Mercury immortal. It was that moment in a white hospital room when his voice became a prayer and every tear that fell around him became applause from heaven. From that day forward, he carried those children inside him, not as fans, but as the purest audience he ever had. As the years pressed on, Freddie's writing began to change. Gone were the extravagant anthems of glory and rebellion. In their place emerged songs laced with quiet melancholy and fragile grace. When the Miracle Sessions began, in 1988, he spent long hours alone at the piano, eyes closed, letting memories of that Munich ward resurface in melodies that no one else could hear. He told producer David Richards one evening, "Music should heal, not just entertain." The line stayed with everyone who heard it. During the recording of Was It All Worth It, Freddie paused midway through the take, staring at his reflection in the studio glass. "Every note I sing now," he said softly, "is a goodbye to someone I once met." Few knew exactly what he meant, but those who did remembered the letter, the hospital, and the boy named Lucas. His voice, though growing weaker, carried more soul than ever, as if he were pouring every last ounce of himself into one final gift to the world. At night, between takes, he'd hum fragments of lullabies that never made it into any album. Sometimes he would stop and say, "You know, somewhere in Munich there's a boy who sang with me once. He reminded me that love doesn't fade, it just changes shape." Peter Freestone later said those quiet nights were when Freddie was at his truest, not the showman, but the soul behind the spectacle. And when the world finally heard the show must go on, few realized that beneath the triumph was a silent prayer for those children who had taught him what courage truly meant. Each lyric echoed that hospital corridor, the trembling voices, the soft crying doctors, and the sound of hope refusing to die. Freddie didn't need to speak their names. The song itself became their monument. In the spring of 1990, long before the public knew the truth about his illness, Freddie returned quietly to Munich. He arrived unannounced, wearing a simple black coat and a wool scarf that covered half his face. The city that had once echoed with his laughter now felt like a faded photograph. Instead of luxury hotels or recording studios, his car stopped in front of the same hospital where years earlier he had played that hauntingly beautiful concert. He asked not to be recognized. He didn't want fanfare or pity. Inside, the corridors seemed smaller, the walls freshly painted, but the air still carried that same faint sterility mixed with human warmth. Dr. Müller recognized him instantly, though his face had thinned and his movements were slower. "You came back," the doctor whispered. Freddie smiled faintly and replied, "I never really left." They walked together to the pediatric ward. Now quieter, many of the children gone, some healed, some remembered only through framed photos by the window. Freddie stood before Lucas's picture, the boy's wide grin frozen in time. Dr. Müller told him Lucas had passed peacefully the year before, humming "We Are the Champions" until his final breath. Freddie's eyes filled instantly, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then he placed a small queen pin beside the photo and whispered, "You were the champion, my darling." The doctor watched as Freddie closed his eyes, holding on to the silence like a prayer. Before leaving, he sat once more at the same old piano, now tuned and polished, and played the first bars of Love of My Life. His voice was weaker, almost a whisper, but the melody carried through the hallway like a ghost returning home. Nurses passing by stopped and listened. Some began to cry, not because they saw a legend, but because they felt the same sacred presence that once made even doctors weep. When the song ended, Freddie stood, kissed the piano gently, and said, "Now I can go." When Freddie returned to London after that final visit to Munich, something inside him had settled. The man who once filled rooms with thunderous laughter now spoke softly, his sentences measured, almost musical. Garden Lodge, his home in Kensington, became a sanctuary of candles, music, and quiet reflection. Friends noticed how he spent hours by the window, staring at the sky as if waiting for someone he loved to appear. He told Peter Freestone, "Munich closed a circle for me. I saw where my voice truly belonged." There was no bitterness in him, only acceptance. Even as his health declined, he refused to let despair take center stage. Every evening he played the piano, often returning to the melody of Love of My Life. His hands trembled, but his expression carried a peace few had ever seen. "If my voice fades," he said one night, "I want it to fade with grace." He wasn't rehearsing anymore. He was saying goodbye, one note at a time. Mary Austin visited often, bringing flowers and sitting quietly beside him. Sometimes he would ask her to light candles and play recordings from the Munich concert era, though no one had ever filmed that hospital moment. "I can still hear their voices," he told her. "Those children taught me to sing differently, not louder, but deeper." Mary smiled through tears, understanding that this was Freddie's way of finding immortality beyond the stage. As days grew shorter, he began writing short letters to people he'd met along the way, crew members, old friends, and even fans who had once sent him heartfelt messages. Each letter ended the same way: "Keep singing, always." Though his body weakened, his spirit only seemed to grow stronger. The man who had once chased applause now sought silence, the same sacred stillness he had found in that hospital corridor, surrounded by fragile lives and a song that still refused to die. By November 1991, Freddie's body was frail, yet his will remained unbroken. He gathered the strength to record one final message, not for the press, not for the stage, but for those who had walked life's quiet corridors with him. Sitting in his studio wrapped in a shawl, he looked directly at the camera and said, "If I've learned anything, it's that music isn't about being heard. It's about feeling alive, even when no one's listening." His voice wavered, but never lost its dignity. Those who stood nearby could sense that this wasn't just a farewell, it was an offering. He spoke of gratitude, of the people who had taught him love, and of the children in Munich who had shown him that courage isn't measured in applause. When he finished, he smiled faintly and said, "The show doesn't have to go on forever, just long enough to reach the right hearts." That line, simple and raw, became the echo that outlived him. On the night of November 23rd, hours before the world would learn of his illness, Freddie played one last song at home. The piano keys glowed softly under candlelight. It wasn't Bohemian Rhapsody, nor We Are the Champions. It was Love of My Life. His fingers moved slowly, each chord carrying a lifetime. When he finished, he whispered, "Good night, my darlings," and leaned back with a peaceful smile. Mary Austin later said it was as if he had been singing to someone beyond the room, perhaps to Lucas, perhaps to all those children whose laughter still haunted the halls of Munich. The next day he was gone, but in that quiet farewell he had already become eternal. The man the world saw as larger than life had left behind something far more human, proof that true greatness is not in how loud one sings, but in how deeply one touches the silence afterward. In the years after Freddie's passing, the Munich hospital became something of a legend, whispered only among staff and former patients. The piano he played that December morning still stood in the corner of the children's ward, now restored, but never moved. Nurses said that sometimes, late at night, they could hear faint notes drifting from it, though no one was there. A small plaque was added beside it, in memory of the man who sang for us when the world wasn't watching. Visitors would stop, touch the worn keys, and feel the warmth of a moment preserved in silence. Lucas's mother, who still volunteered there, often told new families the story of the day a rock star became an angel. "He didn't come for glory," she'd say. "He came because he remembered us, and somewhere beyond fame, beyond time." And that truth lingered, that even the brightest stars shine differently when they choose to illuminate the darkest rooms. Years later, when Queen's songs played across generations, few knew of the quiet morning that had changed their meaning forever. Every time "Love of My Life" echoed through speakers, it carried the ghosts of that hospital, the trembling voices of children who once sang along, and the man who gave them more than music. For Freddie, immortality was never in statues or stages. It was in the soft strength of those who kept singing despite pain. His legacy lived not only in the roar of concerts, but in whispers, in every person who found courage through his voice. The world remembered him as a legend, but those who heard him that day in Munich remembered something else entirely. A man who sang not to be remembered, but to remind the world that even in sorrow, beauty still breathes. And though the show did go on, somewhere in the echo of those halls, his final note still lingers, tender, eternal, and impossibly human.